Okay. So now, as I told you, that these are the process should be done by the DNS before it interacts to the actual IP address server, right? Now, when the systems, when the hosts are doing this, there is some delay will happen in order to translate from host name to IP address. Why? Because the host name first it should send to a DNS server. DNS server should search in a database and give a reply by sending the IP address. Okay, right. This is what it has happened. Okay, so now this is one of the additional delay which has been happened due to this DNS. So normally DNS provides a few important services in addition to translating host name to IP address. Now, what are those? The first thing is host aliasing. Now, what do I mean by host aliasing? See, suppose I have created my website or a host name with a very long name. Okay, for an example, I have taken here as relay1.westcoast.enterprise.com. This is the full URL address. This is the full URL address. Now, I am trying to convert this big name into a very small name. I am to create a shortcut of this. So that I have created it as www.enterprise.com. So when I, instead of typing this big URL, I can type this small URL in order to communicate to the same URL address. Now this we call it as alias. So these alias names will be maintained by our DNS servers itself. Okay, right? So now in this case, this big name, whatever it is having, we call this as canonical name. Okay, and this www.enterprise.com we call it as alias name. Okay, right? Canonical name will be bigger, alias name will be shorter, but both of them will be pointing to the same IP address. Okay, next one, the mail server aliasing. Now, what do you mean by mail server aliasing? Now, say I am working in surveyet.edu. I have my own email address raghav_is at surveyet.edu. Right. So now, instead of having so much big name raghav_is@sarameti.edu, I'll just make it very simple as rag@sarameti.edu. This kind of facility of aliasing is also provided by the DNS. So thus that mail address whichever had the very big name raghav_is@sarameti.edu is translated is translated into a very small name. Now, this type of email address where I am translated into small name, that type of thing we call it as mail server aliasing, and again this will be done by our DNS server itself. Okay, next. Next goes the services provided by DNS is the load distribution. Okay, now what happens normally is that, see, normally many of the users will try to visit www.google.com. In such a case, when all of them try to get the host name translated into IP address, now this DNS server will be loaded very much. It will be will get very busy. So instead of doing this, what I do, as like we have done in the last class, we have studied about the web caching or the proxy servers. We also place several web servers. In that web servers, the DNS database will be maintained. The copy of the DNS database will be maintained, right? So whenever I send a query, DNS query, now this query we'll first go for the nearest DNS server. Now this nearest DNS server will be able to reply to me by giving the IP address. Now this is what the load distribution is, right? So with all these things, these are all the things where DNS will provide the service. The first one is the host aliasing, second one is the mail server aliasing, third one is the load distribution. Okay. Now coming to the overview of how exactly the DNS is going to work is whatever we have discussed, the same thing will holds good here. Okay. So in this case of DNS server, so there is, let me assume that I'm trying to open some URL address where that URL address should get translated to its own IP address. Okay. So what we can do is that in this case, when DNS wants to send a query, as I told, it sends a query by using an UDP datagram at the port number 53. Okay, so DNS port number is 53. So once it sends to a DNS server in turn, it will give a reply within the fraction of milliseconds or seconds. Okay, right. Now this is how the DNS server is able to send the IP address for us. If suppose now I will do my DNS server, the hierarchical form of the DNS server in a different format. Why? Because having only one DNS server or a centralized DNS server will create a problem. Now, what are the problems included in this centralized server is a single point of failure. Now, what do you mean by single point of failure? If everyone, millions of people try to communicate to the same DNS server, then that server become crash, right? Now, the second point is traffic volume. As I told, this DNS server will be handling millions of queries, and that server should be able to handle all those queries. So that traffic, whether it is going to maintain or not, that is the one of the thing or one of the problem we should take care. The third one is the distance centralized database. That means a single DNS server cannot be close to all the querying clients. If you put single DNS server in New York City, then all queries from Australia must travel to other side of the globe, perhaps over slow and congested links, right? So we cannot do that. That is also one of the problem. Next is maintenance. By using the single DNS server we'll maintain all the records, right, in the same centralized server. But I want to update my database which is there in the DNS server every time. So during that updation process, so might be the chances that my data may get lost. That will may also happen. So these are all the four points where the problem will occur due to the centralized DNS server. One is single point of failure, traffic volume, distance centralized database, and the maintenance. So in order to avoid this centralized DNS server, we try to have a distributed hierarchical database. Distributed hierarchical database. Now, what do you mean by this? We will study.